Hi, it's me again. So, good morning once again, and I'm going to present our chapter on teaching talent, how to attract, grow, inspire, and keep great educators in Venezuela. Decades of research have converged on a powerful conclusion. The quality of an education system cannot exceed the quality of its teachers. That's the opening line of Emiliana Vega's and Eduardo Piña's chapter. And today, I'll once again be speaking about on teaching talent in our country. I want to achieve three things today. I want to share why teachers matter, share global evidence on quality and learning, Venezuela's teacher crisis, a profession that has hollowed out, and number three, share the five-pillar framework that Emiliana and Eduardo have built in a way to rebuild education and the teaching profession in our country. Let me start with global evidence on teacher quality and student learning. Among all school-based factors, great teaching has the biggest impact on student learning. When students have a highly effective teacher, about 1 standard deviation above average, that translates into roughly 0.20 standard deviations of extra learning in a year. That's like adding several months of progress. By contrast, most generic education technology beats generic tech gains and learning gains by 0.01 standard deviations. More importantly, strong teaching adds up for vulnerable students. Multiple years of strong teachers equals to 0.9 standard deviations of extra learning for our students. Teacher quality is also cost-effective and has long-term economic and developmental effects. Once the basics are in place and our teachers receive what they need, we must invest in teacher practice. Effective teaching also pays off over the long run. When we invest in our teachers and students are able to be safe and achieve college and later in life. And again, improving teaching is central to closing learning gaps for more vulnerable students. High-performing systems also share a playbook. They share selective recruitment, practice-based preparation, continuous learning, and career structure pay. Our goal and our question is, how can we get Venezuela to follow the playbook of high-performing systems? Second, Venezuela teachers crisis, an aging, shrinking, and deprofessionalized workforce. I'm going to share some facts about how Venezuela teacher workforce is in collapse, specifically our teacher shortage and profession characteristics. First, 50% of teachers have exited the profession between 2015 and 2023. Second, 34% of required teaching positions remain unfilled. 32% of filled posts held by people without formal training. And 60% of teachers report 10 plus years of service, and young cohorts remain absent. Over 200,000 basic education teachers are also down about half of the pre-crisis levels. What does this mean in real practice? Systemic teacher shortages reshape schooling, deprofessionalization of the teaching workforce, and unequal and fragile learning opportunities for students. These are all the conditions of our teachers and what it means to be a student in Venezuela. You can look at the percentages in here, but our schools have deteriorated physical conditions. We lack reliable electricity, lack water, and 93% of schools have almost no internet access whatsoever, and our teachers do not have the didactic resources for their instruction. These are also the working conditions of our teachers. 95% of their real wage has declined since 2015, and it's also the lowest paid teaching professionals in Latin America. Their income only makes for 25% of the basic food basket. And the flattened salary scale just means that even if you're a novice teacher, you're making almost the same amount of someone that has been working as a teacher for over 10 years. And this is the reality of what it means to be a teacher in Venezuela. Our rules are outdated. Since the 2000s, things remain the same. And promotions, as everything else in Venezuela, are based on seniority and discretionary over who rules the schools, not over merit. And that's what we want to change. It's also politicized hiring. Positions are increasingly just awarded due to who supports who. Again, this is what we are used to back home. And interim appointments, interinatos, proliferate without clear criteria. This is one of Emiliana's favorite things. She always goes back to having an evaluation and making sure that we keep track of how our teachers are doing and the education is following the evidence, as she will call it. So there are no national teaching standards or regular evaluation cycles, and there is no use of student learning data to inform feedback or development. Emiliana really wants to change that. And the result is that our message that the government or the regime has given is that teachers and what they do is irrelevant, and it results in strong performance receive no recognition. Weak performance continue without any support, and principals are chosen for loyalty rather than instructional leadership. An individual effort has little bearing or income or career. And this is Emiliana's and Eduardo's 5-pillar framework to rebuild the teaching profession at the heart of recovery of our country. There are 5 interlocking pillars for Venezuela. First, pre-service training. Second, selection and assignment. Evaluation for improvement. Fourth, professional development. And fifth, pay, careers, and conditions. Think of this as an ecosystem. The idea is that all 5 of them will work together, and if one of them fails, the ecosystem just stops functioning. Now, the reality of Venezuela is that we will slowly try to achieve each of them once we get, the goal is to get to the 5 pillars altogether. And I'll quickly go through pillars 1 and 2. The idea is, again, to build a pipeline, then select on merit. Pre-service training, raise entry standards so that young people, those of us hearing us, can join the teaching profession and become educators in our country. Rearrange curricula toward practice, standardized quality, and open regulated alternative routes so that more people can join and become teachers. Number 2, selection and assignment. Our goal is that we have quality teachers, and those who stand in front of our students are quality teachers, and our students have the best of the best. And that means having an autonomous selection agency, another one of Emiliana's favorites, by the way, a multi-instrument selection, transparent rule-based assignment, and merit-based principles. Number 3 and 4, evaluate to develop, develop to scale. Evaluation for improvements. Our idea is to have multiple measures, regular cycles, actionable feedback, consequential probation, phase rollout, and safeguard. This will allow for the teaching profession to not, again, be based on politics, but on merit. And number 4, professional development, a personal favorite. Teachers need to be and receive the assistance that they need in order to be qualified to teach our students. And the way in which we're proposing this is to have a structured induction so that before our students have a teacher, they have received the education, our teachers receive the education that they need. School-based learning, evidence-based content, and hybrid AI-assisted scale. And your goal, or pillar number 5, where I hope, Emiliana hopes, and Eduardo hopes, and I'm sure all of us as well, our country gets to, is to restore dignity, pay, careers, and working conditions. What does this mean? For our teachers, to restore a dignified wage and improve working conditions for all Venezuelan teachers. Build a multi-career ladder, a profession that we want to join, and reward hard-to-staff service. I'll quickly also go through the implementation, but the idea is to go into this into 3 phases. It is not easy, and we have a really huge challenge ahead of us. The phase number 1 is to stabilize. It will take 1 to 2 years to provide emergency salary support for our teachers, national teacher and school census, basic learning assessment, learning creation of an autonomous teacher agency, Emiliana's favorite. Number 2, or phase 2, is to rebuild in years 3 and 5. For like competitive recruitment and assignment, regional PD centers, a structured induction for novice teachers, and reform initial teacher education. Phase number 3, years 6 and 10. Consolidate the career ladder, approach regional salary benchmarks, fund promotion slots, institutionalize PD, mentoring, reduce vacancies, and embed reforms across political cycles. To our policymakers in the room, commit to a multi-year plan to restore, pay, social protection, depoliticize hiring, and build a data system without policy being blind. To our teachers and their organizations, insist on standards, fair evaluation, and transparent rules. They protect ordinary teachers from arbitrary power, which is what Venezuela has been used to for too long. to our international partners. We really do need you. Finance salary top-ups, support autonomous agencies, strengthen teacher education, and share regional tools and evidence. And before I close, I want to leave you with this. If Venezuela is to reveal its social fabric and its economy, it must first rebuild the profession that shapes every future citizen and every Venezuelan and every future worker. Muchísimas gracias.
Okay. So now I'd like to welcome the speakers for our panel. We have Juan Saavedra, a professor at the Harvard Kennedy School, Valentina, and then Eric Taylor, a professor at the Harvard Graduate Education School. And our moderator will be Felipe Vergara, a student at the Harvard Graduate Education School. So please help me welcome our panelists.
Hi, everyone. There it is. Hi, everyone. I hope you enjoyed our first presentation of today, in which we spoke about teaching talent, something very important. Thank you, Valentina, for the presentation. So to enjoy this moment, we'll ask our great panelists here a couple of questions. Welcome, Professor Juan, Professor Eric. Glad to share this space with you. After those questions, we'll ask some questions from you. So be prepared. We'll ask from all the different sections of the room, so all of you can be here after this, okay? So I will start with you. You can choose whoever wants to start. But first, welcome. I'm glad that you're here. As Juan said before, Professor Juan is a professor in the Harvard Kennedy School, and Professor Eric is a professor in the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and my former teacher. It's amazing to share this space with you. So first, to start this conversation, I want to ask you, both of you, if teacher quality is the most important school-based driver of learning, as we have been discussing today, how should countries facing institutional collapse prioritize reforms when they cannot fix everything at once? Yes.
Yeah, sure. Okay, go ahead. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's a great honor to be here. So you're right. I think teacher policy is the binding constraint in recovery. And the strategy that Venezuela implements needs to balance both the quantity of teachers in the short term, as you've heard, there's a severe shortage, and then sort of like over time, build on the quality of teaching. So evidence from effective educational system recovery, sort of like looking at, post-conflict regions in the world and others, emphasizes that teacher supply is sort of like the binding constraint in the beginning. And so the general lesson from those systems is that, in an initial phase, what you have to do is just get children back into classrooms and get a teacher into every classroom. So you retain the experience that you can, hire fast, and train continuously as much as you can, as Valentina was mentioning. And then in a second phase, which roughly coincides with, like phase 2 and phase 3 of the previous presentation, you start sort of like upgrading teacher quality and professionalism over time. Build the career ladders, incentives, and so forth. So some common early strategies to sort of like, the shock therapy. You want to retain as much as you can, identify and retain those experienced teachers that, can serve as leaders, as mentors, as mobilizers. You want to do very rapid recruiting and relicensing and hiring. And, you might need to lower the sort of like the standards for hiring temporarily, but you just have to fill in those classrooms. Provide in-service quick training, in-service training, emergency pedagogy, provide, very structured materials, very structured lesson plans. Bridge academies, for example, comes to mind, where they have a very standardized sort of curriculum that, it's very easy for any teacher to sort of like adapt to a basic level. And then sort of like provide support for, like lesson plans and development of the curricular materials. And obviously, as you've heard, there's sort of like an economic element to that initial phase, which is that teachers aren't getting paid as well as they need. So you need to sort of like stabilize salaries by raising it to like some basic living standards and providing some other support, whether that be in kind, food, baskets, housing, transportation, and so forth. And then over time, you sort of like, start building the quality by, as Valentina mentioned, building the career ladders, professionalization, raising the hiring standards, but that's going to take time. And so I think in the beginning, you really need to sort of like do the shock therapy of getting as many teachers as you can back into the classroom. Obviously, a big question that I'm just going to sort of like pose. I don't have the answer to it, but I want you to all think about is, how is Venezuela going to pay for this? How is this going to be, how costly is it going to be? Because, if you look at sort of educational systems around the world, about 70% of government budgets are devoted to teacher pay. So, if you want to quadruple spending per student, that's a substantial funding commitment. And so thinking about how you're going to pay for that is sort of like a big open question.
Yeah, as Juan said, thank you for having us. And I think, for my part, I think Juan covered most of the important territory. Maybe I would just emphasize a couple of things that he said. We want to be selective in who teaches. We want to invest in helping teachers improve their skills. You can't do that if there's no teacher in the classroom, right? And right now, by far, the first order challenge in Venezuela, it seems, is compensation, right? Lots of people have left the classroom. There are amazing, wonderful teachers who are sticking around, and Valentina told stories about some of those teachers, and they deserve our enormous thanks. But we need more than just those teachers. We need many, many more teachers just to fill the classrooms, let alone to do the kinds of selection and training that have been raised. And at the end of the day, that comes back to compensation. But compensation is not just salaries in 2026, right? It's about expectations for the future. Often in public education, we make this useful trade-off between current compensation and things like stability and future pension compensation. And if teachers if we're looking to recruit teachers in an environment where there's a lot of uncertainty and skepticism about the future promises that the government is making, that's just going to make it very difficult to recruit. So my sense is, as Juan was saying, you need some immediate infusion of compensation to recruit new teachers, to draw back in some of the teachers who have left. And that's expensive. It's not clear where that money would come from, but I think something like that is sort of first order.
Thank you both for those answers. I think that leads us to the second question, that there are many things and many constraints in this aspect, especially budget constraints. So for that, we will have to decide, not me, unfortunately, but somebody else. We'll have to make some decisions about where should we put our first effort. So what worries you the most about rebuilding this teaching profession in Venezuela? Because you said many things, so would you put all the effort in attracting new talent or supporting the ones that are actually the current workforce? Or first you would start by rebuilding institutional trust to then continue by those two aspects that I said before? And we can go the other way around, and then Valentina can share something.
No, you go first.
All right. Well, we've already said a lot of things, but I want to go back to something that Emiliana mentioned, which apparently we're going to talk more about when we get to Strategy 5, which is to think in new ways about financing and organizing the school system, right? The enormous set of challenges that exist in Venezuela today, as Emiliana said, are also an opportunity to rebuild in a new way. We don't have to follow what other school systems are doing. And I think we should think about that in terms of compensation for teachers, right? So one example of this would be to build compensation systems that reward successful teachers. And I think that would go a long way to both drawing in new individuals into the teaching profession, but also provide an environment in which there is a reward for learning and growing and developing your skills as a teacher. So all of that sort of hinges on the expectation that those benefits will be there in the long run. But I think there are new and innovative ways to think about compensating teachers. That, by the way, compensation is not just about money; it's about working conditions and other aspects of the job. But I think there are new opportunities to think about in different ways about how to compensate teachers that would go a long way towards some of the goals that have been stated.
Thank you. That's a great introduction, Eric. I completely agree with what you said, but I would sort of like take a slightly different stance, which is that in the short term, we cannot sort of like sacrifice the current generations for the sake of the future generations. And so to me, the most worrying constraint is supporting the current workforce and stabilizing the current teaching workforce, because everything else, new talent, long-term trust, builds on basically like reverting the current situation in which everyone wants to leave. Okay? To me, recruitment follows stabilization. And so if you can't stabilize the current workforce today, that's going to undermine future recruitment and, trust and any sort of like evidence-based innovation along the lines of what Eric is mentioning. So what you currently have is a vicious cycle in which the current teachers are underpaid, they cannot make ends meet, they have low morale, they are experiencing burnout, and so they exit or are totally disengaged. The students then don't learn, so public trust declines, the profession becomes unattractive, more people leave, and then you just repeat over and over again. That's kind of like the current vicious cycle. You want to reverse that, and so you want to sort of like, I think, where policy should focus on initially is stabilizing the current teachers, whatever it needs along the lines of what Eric was mentioning, pay support, keep them there, make sure they can make ends meet, preserve that baseline instructional capacity, however weak it is, try to rebuild school cultures, because that sort of like, is what creates learning environments. Learning will improve over time. It will take time. It won't be sort of like a magic sort of like thing happen, even if it's modestly. Then you can have public confidence sort of like increasing, believing that, this system actually has the power to transform individuals. Then, like you sort of like can have mission-driven hiring, better candidates will enter the profession, the status increases, and then, that virtuous cycle repeats over again. But so without stabilizing it, in the short term, it's going to be very hard to reverse the current trend.
Thank you both for that answer. I think it's very hard to decide in which part of the cycle we have to focus, but it's very interesting to at least have the opportunity to analyze that answer. Valentina, would you like to share something about what the professor said?
I think I will first want to thank you both. It is such an honor to be sitting here next to you, and especially Professor Taylor. He was both of our professor last semester, so yes, surreal and super exciting. I think I will just agree with what both of you have to say, and maybe add that my personal interest is on one of the points that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, which is our current teacher workforce is filled by teachers who have been working for more than 10 years in Venezuela. And a personal passion of mine is to get young people like myself in front of our students and find innovative ways to get them excited about being teachers. I think all the things that you mentioned need to happen first. And then once that is stabilized, as the way you put it, find alternatives, innovation, which is something that you mentioned, Professor, to get more young people in front of our students. Something that I particularly enjoy, and there are ways that the United States do it, is through alternatives such as Teach for America, Teach for All, and bringing versions of those in Venezuela and bring our very own Enseña por Venezuela and different alternatives like those.
Thank you, Valentina. We'll now move into questions specifically for each of our panelists here. So I will start with Professor Saavedra. Professor, in Latin America, education reforms often fail not because the ideas are weak, but because the states struggle to sustain implementation over time. What would it take for teacher talent policies in Venezuela to become politically and institutionally durable across time?
Thank you. I think that's a hard question. It's what I'm going to say. Keep in mind that it's easier said than done. I think the devil is in the details, and kudos to whoever is able to sort of like implement some of these ideas, because I think the hard work is doing things and affecting change on the ground, I think it's easier to just, talk and benchmark about what we think works. So first of all, I completely agree with, the presentation and sort of like the interlocking ecosystem that, should happen, where you have different dimensions that need to sort of like all take place to increase the quality of the workforce over time. I think, everyone has clarity, like what that benchmarking is important. Everyone wants to emulate Singapore, South Korea, Finland. We all know that, like a few 10, 12 years ago, we were tasked of doing sort of like a similar analysis for the country of Colombia. And I think everyone converges on those same ideas. But the question is, like, once you sort of like produce the diagnosis, even if you map the financing, how do you like sort of go from those ideas and good intentions into practice? So I'll just share some, 6 elements that I think are key to, sustaining reform over time, which I think is what's going to be challenging. I think the first one is, and, I've seen this happen in other settings, is sometimes you sort of like align reform with ideology. And I think that's sort of like, potentially, a minefield, because what you want is to align reform with a shared national and long-term goals that everyone can sort of like stand behind, economic competitiveness, prosperity, something like that, and not necessarily driven by political swings. You need definitely to build a broad-based and self-reinforcing coalition that, includes working with teacher unions and other key stakeholders. Sometimes we sort of like treat teacher unions sort of like as a bug. They are the essence, and, teachers are sort of like at the core of the teaching profession. So, you need to sort of like embed reform and have their, voice heard, and, be able to mobilize them to support any reform. You also, I think, you sort of like, you spend a lot of time in your chapter, but you went by on the presentation rather quickly on it. You need to sort of like sequence reform very strategically. You need to build in flexibility because the system, has been sort of like, not working very well for a long time. And in particular, you need to score some early wins so that you can sort of like create more demand for continuation. So thinking about what could those sort of like low-hanging fruit be, early wins that people can see, that, the media can sort of like, capture and, capture the public imagination. I think that's going to be important. I think, it's great to have very ambitious goals, as you mentioned in your presentation and we've been discussing, but you also sort of like need to match, in some ways be a little bit more humble and match the reform ambition with both administrative and fiscal capacity, and understand that those are sort of like, also being affected. And ultimately, like think about how you're going to pay for this, because, you need to sort of like hedge fiscal volatility. And then, I think something that underlines everything that we think, should be done is, like building good quality data systems that can help diagnose progress, keep track of funding, address challenges in a timely manner. And lastly, I would say you want to like just not only like think about, raising adequacy of funding, so getting more funding, but to the extent possible, and I know this is not sort of like necessarily feasible in the Venezuela context, but think about, are there any efficiency gains to be had? I think that's hard to sort of like imagine in a system that has been completely gutted, but, to what extent is there anything that we can sort of like build on that, means doing, more with the same resources while we, mobilize the fiscal capacity to do all of the more ambitious things you're thinking about.
Thank you, Professor, for that. I think many of those suggestions will be said or mentioned in the next panels that you will be seeing today. So I'm glad that this was the introduction for all of them. For Professor Taylor, as an expert, much of the evidence on teacher quality comes from relatively stable systems. I want to know what aspects of the research on effective teaching do you think still hold in context of deep institutional fragility like Venezuela or others, and what assumptions may no longer apply in this context?
So just picking up on where Juan left off and thinking about potential efficiency gains, I think one of the most valuable potential resources in improving education systems is individual teachers and their capacity to grow in their own skills and improve their own individual efficiency. And so thinking carefully about the structures and environment that promote that individual development and growth is critical to thinking about how to improve a teacher workforce anywhere. I think one thing that's common across the globe is that there are, in any variety of political environment, is that there are individual teachers who have a desire to see their students succeed and have a desire to get better at helping their students succeed. But that alone is not sufficient, right? Just because you have that intrinsic motivation does not mean that that will turn into an effort on the part of the teacher to improve their own skills. The rest of the environment constrains and structures that. And so I think, Felipe, when you ask about sort of an uncertain environment like Venezuela, that's where my mind goes. So why would someone invest in their skills? They're going to invest in their skills if they expect that in the future, they will have a return on those investments. So if I think I'm only going to be a teacher for 6 months, I have much less sort of incentive to think about how to get better at being a teacher. If I think I'm going to be a teacher for 20 years, I have a lot of opportunity for those investments to pay off. And so one thing I think that is a real challenge in Venezuela today is that there is a lot of uncertainty about the future. Maria Corina Machado was on NPR the other day and interviewed, and she was asked about like the business environment and why, under what conditions might businesses be more likely to return to Venezuela. And she emphasized the importance of certainty about the future for entrepreneurs and business owners, and the certainty about having a future in Venezuela, having property rights protected, having contracts honored. And I think you can draw a direct parallel to the lives of individual teachers. Without the certainty about whether the government will fulfill its promises to teachers, that mutes the incentive to invest in skills. So I think that's a primary challenge, but that seed, that intrinsic motivation that is the starting point, is common everywhere. And the challenge, I think, in Venezuela is thinking about how to develop some sort of political economy commitment device that convinces teachers that it is a new era and that the government will support schools and teachers for the long run.
Thank you, Professor. We have passionate teachers everywhere, but we don't live from passion only. That's completely right. Okay, it's time now for Q&A from the public. So if you raise your hands, I will choose one from each section. We'll go across the 3 sections, and then whoever wants to answer, the 3 of you can choose 1, 2, or the 3 questions, okay? Is that clear? Good. Raise your hands. Okay, so we have one there. Give me 1 second, we'll get to the mic. In the meantime, one here, and that part, one there. And then I will go back to your question. So keep in mind, here and there with the blue shirt. Please.
Muy buenos días. Mi nombre es María Alejandra Hock, fundadora de la Resistencia Médica, una organización sin fines de lucro, educada y enfocada en la nutrición humanitaria para niños vulnerables. Mi pregunta es, si la evidencia demuestra que un niño con hambre no puede aprender adecuadamente, ¿por qué la nutrición infantil todavía suele tratarse separada de las políticas educativas?
Can you paraphrase it in English?
So her question is, if evidence shows that a kid hungry can't learn, then why the nutrition politics are treated separately than the education politics?
Thank you,
Right?
both. So that's the first question. Now we're here.
Hi, Cristina Folmer Burelli from Venezuela. Can we turn our attention a little bit to the politicians? Years and years of experience in democratic values education and other things have led me to believe that politicians, at least in Latin America, have no incentive to invest in education. Number one, because it's long-term results. Number two, because I think they realize, consciously or unconsciously, that it undermines their terrible leadership. Educated people are not going to elect populist governments. So, as public policy experts, how do you see changing those incentives? What can we do to make sure that politicians understand that they have to invest in education?
Thank you. We'll get the third question, and then we'll start answering whoever wants to start. Over there. Blue shirt over there. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Ramon Hernandez. I'm a student here in HGS. My question is, like Professor Taylor mentioned, like give teacher incentives to invest in their skills. But how to invest in their skills if right now their wages are too low to even cover the minimum life conditions? And also, if you get a decent salary in the future, for sure, the first priority for them is not going to invest in their skills because they have to cover a lot of debts, I suppose. What must be the role of government to increase teacher skills?
Thank you. So whoever wants to start, if you can pick 1, 2, or the 3 questions, it's okay.
Well,
thank you, Professor.
The challenge with having multiple questions is the last one always is top of mind. So I'll just answer very quickly. When I say invest in skills, I don't mean like pay money to go to a class to learn how to be a better teacher. I mean, think consciously about what am I doing today? What should I be doing differently? And I think that opportunity exists for all teachers. I do think that schools have a role to play in those investments because schools can help lower the costs of those investments. I mean, part of the benefit of performance evaluation and performance feedback is reducing the cost of individual teachers investing in their skills by giving them ideas of where to focus their energy and attention. If they're going to expend calories and effort and attention on improving, where should they go first? And the school can help them think about that.
Thank you. And then Professor here.
We do have only 2 minutes left. The nutrition question, if you wanted to address it, Professor, totally fine. But we do have an entire panel dedicated to that. So if you want to go maybe to the other question, please.
I was going to say just the same thing. So I'll take the hardest one, I think, which is sort of like how to mobilize resources over the long term. I completely agree with you. I think, as I mentioned in my earlier remarks, I think we kind of like know what we need to do, but that takes time. It takes the successful systems. Think about South Korea. Think about Singapore. It was sort of like it didn't happen overnight. They were very poor. They had very bad education. But they were able to sort of like mobilize the resources and have the continuity to do it over 30, 40 years. So I think the first thing is that you need to sort of like align any reform efforts with long-term goals. It's sort of like hard for politicians to do, but I think every politician wants their country to be more prosperous, and I think economic prosperity and competitiveness is something that we can all sort of like stand behind. And that could be sort of like, going back to Emiliana's remarks, you saw there's a very strong connection between sort of like the quality of learning and economic prosperity across countries. So if that's sort of like a goal that we can stand behind, maybe that's a sort of like a way that we can put sort of, resources where our mouths are. And then I think, you touched on a good point, which is, political cycles are much shorter than, sort of like the time elapsed to see kind of like these reforms and the impacts that they entail materialize. So you need to sort of like be able to, be strategic in sort of like scaffolding and sequencing the reforms in a way that even the politicians that are deciding to invest in the long run can see sort of like some immediate effects in the short run. So for example, anything that, raises the, passing a new decree that raises the standards for hiring teachers that, requires a college degree, that's fairly sort of like, low cost to do. I mean, it's politically costly, but, you can do it in the short term. That's doable. I know of experiences in other Latin American countries that, over 2 or 3 years, they've been able to substantially increase funding for education, behind sort of like this type of commitments and, devoting more resources to teacher pay, but also to early childhood education, evaluation, data and assessment. So I do think it's possible, but you sort of need to have a common vision that transcends political cycles and political swings.
Okay, thank you all for these answers. With this, we're going to finish the first panel of this conference. So I please ask for a big round of applause for these panelists over here. We're going to take a picture, give you some presents because of coming here, and then we're moving to the next part of the conference.